Happy New Year, folks. Nate here at Two Wheel Dyno Works, and we are back in the shop and on the dyno with more testing, tuning, and R&D on our new GSX8s. If you take a look at the bike right now as it sits on the dyno, it actually doesn't look any different than it did last time we showed it to you. But there have been some very subtle changes that made huge performance improvements, and we're going to show you exactly what that looks like right now. Now, just to recap here real quick, this is how the bike performed last time we built our mapping for the full M4 exhaust system with no baffle in place and the stock velocity stacks with the intake modifications we've already covered before, which is essentially an aftermarket intake lid and an air filter and removing the stock snorkels. And 85 horsepower and 63 foot-pounds of torque was not bad at all. It's a massive gain over stock. However, we've now significantly improved on that yet again. The bike, as I'm sitting on it right now, with that same M4 exhaust system, but with a baffle in the muffler this time, and with some aftermarket velocity stacks, is now making almost 89 horsepower and 62 foot-pounds of torque. Now, the M4 exhaust did not originally come with a baffle. However, after I shared the results with the folks over at M4 when comparing it to the Acropovich exhaust system, where it actually fell short by like 1 to 1.5 horsepower, I said, hey, the outlet of the muffler is pretty large. Go ahead and send me a few different baffle designs. I'll test them for you, let you know which one to send with the systems. And they've done that. So their Q10 baffle is definitely the way to go. Some of the other baffle designs I had actually went the other direction in performance, but the Q10 baffle worked perfectly, and we gained 2 horsepower more than we did without the baffle, regardless of the velocity stacks. And as you can see here, this is what we've done to the intake. This is an aftermarket airbox lid from one of our friendly companies that have asked us not to name who they are, just in case they decide to make a design change, but I don't think they're going to change the lid whatsoever. This thing works fantastic. That's a DNA air filter, and on the inside of it is a set of their velocity stacks that we've now built mapping for and tested rigorously over the last few days. Now, I'm not going to share exactly whose velocity stacks these are, because again, these were prototypes that were sent to us before they released them to the public. They just wanted some independent testing done, and we were more than happy to do it. Now, these velocity stacks are an offset design, which means that individual cylinder tuning or rebalancing the cylinders is going to be almost a necessity when you're using these stacks. And as I said before, our friends over at M4 were kind enough to weld us bungs into each header pipe, so I can go ahead and get our wideband on the dyno into each header tube and tune the cylinders independently of each other. Now, when testing for the performance of the velocity stacks by themselves, I obviously did it in an apples-to-apples way as best as possible. So we want to minimize variables. So that means when I first tested the velocity stacks, the baffle was not in the M4 exhaust system because that made its own performance improvement. So let's show you the before and after of just swapping the velocity stacks with the same M4 exhaust installed. So what you're looking at here, run 24, which is the blue line, is the way that this bike was, again, in the last video we posted with the stock velocity stacks, and now run 26, the red line, is after we've done our individual cylinder tuning for these new velocity stacks without the baffle in the M4 exhaust. And as you can see, you're losing about 2 to 4 horsepower everywhere under 7,000 RPMs. Everywhere above 8,000 RPMs, you're gaining anywhere from 2 to 5 horsepower. Now again, as I've already covered on our other velocity stack modification video that we tested on this bike, which essentially just involved chopping off the velocity stacks and just leaving an open air box, you want your gains to at least be equal to, if not greater than, the losses depending upon where you're looking in the RPM range. So if you're losing 2 to 4 horsepower, but you're gaining 2 to 5 somewhere else, that's a benefit. And where this bike sort of dips off at the end of the RPM range, now it's just carrying flat, that's a fantastic gain. But now if we go ahead and compare the baffle in versus the baffle out with the same velocity stacks, you can see there that run 37, which is with the baffle in, again the Q10 baffle from M4, the bike picks up almost 2 horsepower at peak, 2 foot-pounds of torque almost the entire way through the mid-range, and the gains there from about 6,000 RPMs all the way to 9,000 RPMs are substantial. Now, let's take a step back from the kind of minutia here of the individual onesies and twosies of horsepower and torque figures, and let's look at what this actually does compared to a bike that's bone stock, which is the way that most of you folks are going to be purchasing these bikes and then wanting to modify them. This is how our bike performed on the dyno in bone stock configuration. It made 76 horsepower and 53 foot-pounds of torque. And this is how I'm sitting on it right now at 88, almost 89 horsepower and 62 foot-pounds of torque with our Two Wheel Dyno Works custom ECU flash for the full M4 exhaust system with the Q10 baffle, a aftermarket air filter and lid, and the aftermarket velocity stacks from a company that we can't quite name yet, but I will once we go ahead and get the go-ahead from them to announce whose product we're using. Now, peak to peak, that's a gain of roughly 12 horsepower, 13 horsepower, and about 9 foot-pounds of torque. But right through the meat of the RPM range, when you spend the most time riding this bike, the gains are massively more. You can see where I've highlighted there, right about 7,500 RPMs, you have now gone from making 71 horsepower to 87 horsepower. So you've picked up almost 16 horsepower and 11 foot-pounds of torque where you're primarily riding this bike. That is a 22% improvement to horsepower through the mid-range on this bike from just intake modifications, velocity stacks, an aftermarket exhaust system, and a proper ECU flash with custom tuning for this specific setup. Now, obviously, we are also far from done with modifying and tuning this bike. Again, we bought this bike knowing that it's the same ECU and engine package that's in the S model, the R model, the GSX8, and on the V-Strom 800s. So we are going to have this and be testing and modifying it and building mapping for all those modifications for a long time. We already have several more exhaust systems on the way, and if they perform any better or worse than the M4 does or the Akrapovic does, I'll obviously go ahead and share that with you and say, hey, this is worth getting, this is not worth getting. Because again, all the testing we do here at Two Wheel Dyno Works is completely unbiased. We pay for most of this stuff when it comes to exhaust and intake systems, and with the companies that send us stuff and don't want to be named until we can show that we either get the same results they did or better, well, that's the risk you take. So if you've got one of these badass new little Suzukis and you want to go ahead and uncork a ton of power, definitely go ahead and get yourself a high quality exhaust system. We'll obviously go ahead and again and name the intake modifications that we've done once that company gives us the green light, and purchase our ECU flash for your specific setup at twowheeldinoworks.com. And if you have any questions about the performance modifications or proper tuning for your bike, do not hesitate to email us at support@twowheeldinoworks.com, because we are always happy to help.